New York had taught Emily Carter one thing very early: nobody survived in Manhattan by being soft. At 33, she owned Carter Med Solutions, a fast-growing medical equipment company that supplied surgical tools, imaging systems, and operating room devices to private hospitals across the East Coast. People in polished offices called her sharp. Competitors called her ruthless. Employees called her fair, but impossible to fool. Yet every evening, when the elevator doors opened to the penthouse apartment overlooking the glowing streets below, Emily was not the woman who negotiated million-dollar contracts with hospital boards. She was just a woman who wanted to take off her heels, sit across from someone who loved her, and hear the simple words, "You're home." That was why she fell in love with Daniel Brooks. Daniel was not rich. He did not wear expensive watches or speak in the language of investments and mergers. He was a high school literature teacher in Queens, the kind of man who carried paperbacks in his coat pocket and remembered the names of every student who had ever cried in his classroom. The first time Emily met him, it was raining. She had been leaving a charity fundraiser at a small community center when her phone died and her driver got stuck in traffic. Daniel was standing under the awning with a stack of student essays pressed against his chest. He offered her his umbrella without even knowing who she was. "You'll get soaked," Emily said. Daniel smiled. "I teach teenagers for a living. Rain is not the worst thing I've survived." She laughed. It was the first real laugh she had had in weeks. He walked her 2 blocks to a coffee shop, stayed with her until her driver arrived, and never once asked what she did for work. He asked instead if she liked poetry, whether she had siblings, and what kind of childhood memory still made her smile when she was tired. To Emily, who had spent years surrounded by people calculating her value, Daniel felt like a quiet room after a storm. 6 months later, when he proposed in Central Park with a simple silver ring, Emily said yes before he finished the sentence. Her best friend, Sarah Mitchell, did not celebrate immediately. Sarah was a neurosurgeon at a major hospital in Manhattan, the sort of woman who could read people almost as well as she could read scans. She watched Daniel from across the engagement dinner, watched the way he smiled when Emily spoke, and watched the way his mother, Margaret Brooks, scanned Emily's handbag, shoes, and diamond earrings before complimenting her. Later that night, Sarah pulled Emily aside near the restroom. "I'm not saying he's bad," Sarah said quietly, "but you live in 2 different worlds." Emily folded her arms. "So what? Love isn't a business contract." Sarah sighed. "No, but marriage becomes one when money is involved." Emily looked hurt. "You think Daniel wants my money?" "I think people can start out loving you and still learn to depend on what you provide." Emily shook her head. "Daniel isn't like that." Sarah held her gaze for a long moment, then said the sentence Emily would remember years later like a warning carved into bone. "A man who feels smaller beside you will either grow with you, or punish you for making him feel small." Emily walked away that night angry. She told herself Sarah was being protective, maybe even cynical. Daniel had never once asked her for anything. When Emily apologized for working late, he told her, "I don't need your time to be perfect. I just need your heart to be honest." And when she once said, almost jokingly, "Are you sure you can handle being married to a woman who makes more money than you?" Daniel took both her hands and looked wounded. "Emily," he said softly, "I don't need your money. I just need you." That sentence broke down the last wall around her heart. Their wedding was small but elegant, held at a historic chapel near the Hudson River. Emily paid for almost everything without complaint. Daniel's mother, Margaret, cried through the ceremony, clutching a lace handkerchief and whispering to everyone nearby, "God finally sent my son a good woman." Margaret had been widowed young. She lived in an aging house in Brooklyn with peeling paint, leaking pipes, and furniture that looked older than Daniel himself. Daniel's younger sister, Lily, was still in college, pretty, restless, and constantly dreaming aloud about fashion, travel, and a life bigger than this old neighborhood. The first time Emily visited their house, Margaret served canned soup in chipped bowls and apologized 3 times. "I'm ashamed you have to see us like this," Margaret said. Emily touched her hand. "Please don't say that. Family isn't measured by furniture." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You have a kind heart. Dear, I hope this family deserves you." Emily believed she meant it. After the wedding, Emily moved Daniel into her Manhattan apartment. But Daniel seemed uncomfortable there. He said the glass walls made him feel like he was living in a showroom. "My mom is alone in that old house," he said one evening, staring out at the city lights. "I know she won't say it, but I worry about her." Emily heard the guilt in his voice. Within 3 months, she paid off Margaret's mortgage, renovated the Brooklyn house from top to bottom, and added a small garden in the back because Margaret once mentioned she missed growing roses. When the renovation was finished, Margaret hugged Emily so tightly that Emily could barely breathe. "You are not my daughter-in-law," Margaret whispered. "You are my daughter." Emily cried that day, for a woman who had lost both parents young and built her life alone. Those words felt like a blessing. Then came Lily's tuition. Lily had fallen behind on payments at her private design school. Margaret was embarrassed. Daniel looked helpless. Emily transferred the money before dinner ended. "It's not a big deal," Emily said. Lily squealed and hugged her. "Emily, you're literally saving my future." Soon after, Emily bought Lily a used car, then replaced it with a newer one when Lily complained it looked too sad for design school. She covered Margaret's medical bills, Daniel's student loans, family vacations, holiday gifts, home repairs, and every birthday dinner at restaurants Daniel's family never could have afforded before. At first, every gift came with tears. Then gratitude became expectation. Margaret stopped asking and started suggesting. "The dryer is making that noise again. Emily, dear, do you know someone who can replace it? Lily's laptop is too slow for her design programs. Poor thing cried all night. Daniel works so hard, maybe he deserves a better car too." Emily rarely said no. Daniel noticed less and less, or maybe he noticed everything and chose silence. There were moments when Emily felt something shift. Small things that would have meant nothing alone but together formed a quiet pattern. At family dinners, Margaret would praise Emily in public but complain about her schedule in private. "A wife should come home earlier," she once said while stirring pasta in Emily's kitchen. "Money is good, but a home needs warmth." Daniel said nothing. Another night, Lily joked, "Honestly, if I had your bank account, I'd never be stressed again." Emily smiled politely. Margaret added, "Some people are born lucky." Emily looked up. "I wasn't born with any of this." The room went quiet. Daniel quickly changed the subject. Still, he remained gentle in the ways that mattered most to Emily. Every night, no matter how late she came home, Daniel would be waiting in the kitchen with a warm glass of milk. "You need sleep," he would say. "I'm not a child," Emily teased. "No," he replied, kissing her forehead. "You're my wife. Let me take care of you." The first time he did it, Emily almost refused. She hated milk, but Daniel looked so tender standing there, sleeves rolled up, glasses slightly crooked, that she drank it anyway. After that, the warm milk became their ritual. On nights when she lost contracts, he handed her the glass and listened. On nights when she won, he handed her the glass and smiled. On nights when she was too exhausted to speak, he sat beside her until she finished. To Emily, that glass of milk became proof that beneath all the noise of money, business, and family obligations, someone still cared whether she slept. She did not know Daniel sometimes watched her drink it with an expression too still to be love. One evening, about 2 years into the marriage, Emily came home earlier than expected. A meeting had been cancelled, and for once she wanted to surprise Daniel with dinner. She stepped quietly into Margaret's renovated Brooklyn house, carrying flowers and a box of pastries from a bakery Margaret loved. She heard voices from the kitchen. Margaret was speaking first. "That girl makes money like water," she said, low and amused. "You and Lily would be fools not to make use of it while you can." Emily froze in the hallway. Daniel's voice followed, sharper than she had ever heard it. "Mom, keep your voice down." Margaret laughed. "Why? It's true. She likes being needed. Women like that always do. Just look sad enough." And she opens her wallet. Emily's fingers tightened around the pastry box. There was a long pause. Then Daniel said, "Emily is my wife." Margaret replied, "Then act like a husband. A smart husband. Love is fine, Daniel, but security is better." Emily waited for him to defend her. To say, "Don't talk about her that way." To be the man she believed she married. Instead, Daniel only said, "I know what I'm doing." A cold feeling moved through Emily's chest. She stepped back quietly, left the flowers on the small table near the door, and walked outside before anyone saw her. In the car, she sat for several minutes without starting the engine. "I know what I'm doing." What did that mean? That night, when Daniel came home, he was warm as always. He kissed her cheek, asked about her day, and made her a glass of milk. Emily stared at it. Daniel noticed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said. "You look tired." "I am." He sat beside her, his voice soft. "Drink, it'll help." Emily lifted the glass slowly. The milk smelled faintly sweet, with a trace of vanilla. Daniel had started adding that recently, saying it helped with stress. She took a sip. He smiled. For the first time, the warmth did not comfort her. It sat heavy in her stomach. Across from her, Daniel reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You know I love you, right?" he asked. Emily looked into his eyes and wanted desperately to believe him. "Yes," she whispered. But deep inside, something had cracked. And Emily did not know yet that the crack would become a canyon. She did not know that the family she had fed, housed, protected, and loved was slowly learning how much they could take before she finally noticed. She did not know that the soft-spoken husband who placed warm milk in her hands every night had already begun measuring her life in dollars. Most of all, Emily did not know that the glass she forced herself to finish that evening was not a symbol of love anymore. It was the beginning of her destruction. Boston in late October was colder than Emily expected. The city had a different kind of cold from New York. New York's cold was loud, rushing through avenues between taxis and impatient footsteps. Boston's cold was quieter, sharper, the kind that slipped through the collar of a wool coat and settled into the bones. Emily noticed it the moment she stepped out of the black car in front of the conference hotel near Back Bay. One hand gripping her leather briefcase, the other pressing her phone to her ear. "Yes, Mr. Harrison, I understand," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the wind cutting against her face. "The funds are only for the deposit guarantee. They won't be touched unless the contract moves forward." On the other end, Harrison Gray's voice was calm but firm. "Emily, I trust you. That's why I transferred it to your account. $700,000 is not pocket change. That money belongs to people who don't forgive carelessness." Emily looked up at the hotel's glass doors, where her reflection stared back at her, composed face, dark coat, tired eyes. "I know," she said, "not a dollar will move without your approval." There was a pause. Then Harrison's voice softened. "You sound tired." Emily forced a small smile, though he could not see it. "I'm fine." "You always say that before you collapse." "I don't collapse." "You will if you keep treating your body like office furniture." Emily almost laughed. Harrison had known her since she was 22, back when she was carrying sample boxes from clinic to clinic, trying to convince doctors to trust a young woman with no family name and no investors behind her. He was not her real father, but in every way that mattered, he had become the closest thing she had to one. "I'll rest after the meeting," she promised. "You said that last year." "This year I mean it." Harrison sighed. "Good. And Emily?" "Yes?" "Do not tell anyone more than they need to know about that money. Not staff, not friends, not even family. Large numbers make people reveal who they really are." Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the phone. For a brief second, she remembered Margaret's voice from the kitchen in Brooklyn. "That girl makes money like water." Then Daniel's voice. "I know what I'm doing." Emily swallowed the memory down. "Understood," she said. The Boston trip was supposed to be the turning point for Carter Med Solutions. For months, Emily had been negotiating exclusive distribution rights for a German robotic surgical system that could transform minimally invasive procedures across several hospitals in the region. If she succeeded, her company would enter a new league. If she failed, competitors would swallow the opportunity before she got a second chance. She checked into the hotel, reviewed contracts until midnight, then woke at 5 with a headache so sharp it felt as if someone had pressed a wire behind her eyes. At first, she blamed stress. By noon, during the first negotiation session, the letters on the projection screen blurred for 3 seconds. Emily blinked hard, gripped the edge of the conference table, and continued speaking without missing a sentence. A representative from the German company leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, are you all right?" "Perfectly," she said. She was not. By evening, her hands trembled when she tried to unlock her hotel room door. She dropped the key card twice. Once inside, she took off her heels, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at her own fingers as if they belonged to someone else. Her phone rang. Daniel. For a moment, she did not answer. Then guilt struck her. Whatever she had overheard at Margaret's house, Daniel was still her husband. Maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe his words had meant something else. Maybe exhaustion had turned suspicion into poison. She accepted the call. "Hey," Daniel said gently, "how's Boston treating my favorite woman?" Emily leaned back against the headboard. His voice was warm, familiar. It made the room feel less lonely. "Cold, expensive, full of men who think repeating my ideas louder makes them smarter." Daniel chuckled. "So, normal business trip?" "Pretty much." "You sound off." "I'm just tired." "Did you eat?" Emily looked at the untouched room service menu on the desk. "Yes." "Emily." She closed her eyes. "I had coffee." "That is not food." "I know." There was a pause. Then his voice softened further. "You need to take care of yourself. I wish I was there." Something inside her loosened. "Me too," she whispered. "I packed the supplements in your suitcase. The brown bottle. Take 2 tonight with warm milk if the hotel can send some up. They'll help your nerves settle." Emily opened her eyes. The brown bottle. She had noticed it that morning while unpacking. No brand label, just a dark glass bottle with a plain white sticker on the cap. Daniel had told her they were imported brain support capsules from a colleague whose cousin worked in integrative medicine. Emily had been too busy to ask more. "Daniel," she said slowly, "there's no label on them." "I know. They came from a private clinic. They don't do commercial packaging." "That sounds strange." "They're just supplements. Magnesium, herbal extracts, sleep support. You think I'd give you something unsafe?" The hurt in his voice made her feel cruel. "No," she said quickly. "I didn't mean that. I'm worried about you, that's all. I know. You need to be healthy. Money, contracts, all of that can wait. You just need to get better. Let me worry about everything else." Emily stared at the brown bottle sitting on the nightstand. "Let me worry about everything else." He said it like love, like protection, like the exact thing she had always longed to hear. "Okay," she said. That night, the hotel sent up warm milk in a ceramic mug. Emily opened the bottle, shook 2 pale blue capsules into her palm, and hesitated. They looked ordinary, small, harmless. She almost laughed at herself. "Are you really suspicious of vitamins now?" she muttered. She swallowed them. For the next 2 days, she functioned on willpower alone. In meetings, she was brilliant. Alone, she was falling apart. Her headaches grew worse. Sometimes her vision flickered at the edges, as if the world were a screen losing signal. She forgot the name of a hospital administrator she had known for 3 years. She signed one document in the wrong place and only caught the mistake because her assistant, Nora, pointed it out quietly. "Emily, maybe you should rest," Nora said after the second meeting. "I'll rest when the contract is signed." "You look pale." I said I'm fine. Nora lowered her voice. "You're scaring me." Emily wanted to snap back, but the concern in Nora's face stopped her. She took a breath. "I'm sorry, it's just a migraine." That evening, Daniel surprised her by arriving in Boston. When Emily opened her hotel room door and saw him standing there with an overnight bag, she nearly broke down. "What are you doing here?" He smiled, tired but tender. "My wife is sick in another city. Did you think I'd stay home grading essays?" For the first time in days, Emily let herself lean into him. Daniel held her tightly, stroking the back of her head. "You're burning up," he murmured. "I'm just exhausted. Sit down." He moved around the room with practiced care, closing the curtains, ordering soup, calling the front desk for extra blankets. When the food arrived, he fed her half the bowl himself, laughing softly when she complained. "I can hold a spoon. Daniel. You can run a company. That doesn't mean you're allowed to act invincible in front of me." Later, he prepared the milk. Emily watched him from the bed. He stood with his back partly turned, opening the brown bottle. The capsules made a soft clicking sound as they dropped into his palm. He paused for a second, then placed them beside the mug. Something about that pause bothered her. "Daniel?" He turned. Where exactly did you get those?" He smiled, but not immediately. "I told you, a clinic connection." "What clinic?" "Emily, why are you interrogating me?" "I'm not. I just want to know what I'm taking." He came to the bed and sat beside her, his face full of wounded patience. "You're exhausted, you're stressed, your body is reacting. These are helping you sleep. I feel worse. Because you're working 18 hours a day." He picked up the mug and held it out. "Drink, please." Emily looked at him. His eyes were soft, his hand was steady. This was the man who had walked her through rain, who read poems to students, who kissed her forehead when she came home late. This was her husband. "Maybe I'm becoming paranoid," she thought. "Maybe Sarah was wrong. Maybe I was wrong." She took the mug. Daniel watched until she swallowed. By morning, she woke with a nosebleed. Blood had spotted the white pillowcase beneath her face. She stared at it for several seconds, confused, before panic rose in her throat. Daniel was already beside her. Hey, it's okay." He pressed tissues gently under her nose. "Dry hotel air. It happens. I never get nosebleeds. You're under pressure. My head hurts. I'll cancel your morning meeting." "No." Emily tried to sit up, but the room tilted. Daniel caught her shoulders. "Emily, stop." His tone was sharper than usual. She looked at him. For half a second, something unfamiliar crossed his face. Irritation. Not worry, not love, irritation. Then it vanished. He kissed her hand. "I'm sorry, I'm just scared." She wanted to believe that. The deal closed the next day. Emily stood in a conference room overlooking the Charles River, shook hands with men who suddenly treated her like a partner instead of a risk, and smiled for photographs while her skull pulsed with pain. The contract was not final yet, but the deposit guarantee had been accepted. The next phase would begin once financial verification cleared. Harrison called to congratulate her. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Emily replied. "Come home, rest." "I will." Daniel drove her back to New York that evening. She slept most of the ride, drifting in and out of strange dreams. Margaret laughing in a kitchen. Lily holding keys to a house. Daniel's hand stirring milk that turned slowly red. When they reached Manhattan, Daniel helped her upstairs. He made soup. He dimmed the lights. He told her not to check email. For 3 days, Emily stayed home. But rest did not heal her. She became weaker. She dropped a glass in the kitchen and stared at the broken pieces. Unable to remember why she had walked there, she forgot the passcode to her office tablet. Once, in the middle of a call with Nora, she lost her train of thought completely and had to pretend the connection was breaking. Daniel was always there. Too there. He hovered when she took calls. He asked who texted her. He reminded her to drink the milk. He placed the capsules in her hand before bed. He began answering questions for her when Margaret visited. "She's just overwhelmed," he told his mother. Margaret sighed dramatically. "Poor thing. All that money, all that stress. A woman's body isn't made for this much pressure." Emily was too tired to respond. One afternoon, She found the brown bottle in Daniel's jacket pocket instead of the medicine cabinet. She held it up when he came into the bedroom. "Why are you carrying this around?" Daniel stopped. Only for a second. Then he smiled. "So you don't forget to take them." "I'm not a child." "No," he said quietly. "But lately you're not yourself." The words stung. Emily placed the bottle on the dresser. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm worried. Or it means you want me to think I'm losing control." Daniel's expression changed, slowly, carefully. "Where is this coming from?" Emily looked at him, breathing faster now. "I don't know." He stepped closer. "Do you hear yourself? You're accusing me because I'm trying to help you." "I'm not accusing you." "You are." His voice broke then, just enough to make her doubt herself. "I left work. I came to Boston. I'm cooking, cleaning, taking care of you, and somehow I'm the villain?" Emily's throat tightened. "No, Daniel, I didn't mean." He turned away, hurt. And just like that, she became the one apologizing. That night, she drank the milk without arguing. At 2 a.m, Emily woke with a violent cramp twisting through her stomach. She stumbled to the bathroom, one hand against the wall, her vision swimming. Her knees hit the tile floor before she reached the toilet. Then she vomited. At first, it was only bitter liquid. Then red. Dark red. Emily stared down, frozen. For a few seconds, her mind refused to understand what her eyes were seeing. Blood. Her hands began to shake. Behind her, Daniel appeared in the doorway. "Emily?" She turned slowly. He looked at the blood, then at her. His face went pale, but not with surprise. With fear. Not fear for her. Fear of being discovered. And for the first time since she married him, Emily felt something colder than pain settle inside her chest. She was afraid of the man standing behind her. Daniel stepped forward. "Don't panic," he said, "it's probably nothing." Emily backed away from him, one trembling hand gripping the sink. Blood still burned in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, to call Sarah, to call Harrison, to ask the man she had loved why his care felt more like a cage every day. But Daniel reached for her with that same gentle hand that had once held an umbrella over her in the rain. "Come on," he whispered, "let me help you." Emily looked at his hand. Then at the brown bottle sitting on the bedroom nightstand behind him. And deep in her bones, a terrifying thought finally became impossible to ignore. Maybe the danger was not outside her home. Maybe it had been sleeping beside her all along. New Jersey, private medical center. The night Emily collapsed, it rained. Not the kind of rain that people notice. No thunder, no dramatic lightning, just a steady, quiet drizzle that blurred the lights of Manhattan into long streaks of gold and white. Emily barely remembered how it started. One moment, she was standing in the kitchen, holding a glass of water, trying to swallow the bitter taste still lingering in her throat from the night before. The next, the world tilted. Her fingers loosened. The glass slipped from her hand, shattered against the floor. And then, nothing. Ellipsis. When she opened her eyes again, everything was white. Too white. The ceiling lights burned into her vision. The smell of antiseptic filled her lungs. Machines beeped in slow, steady rhythms that didn't feel like her own. Her head throbbed like something inside it was trying to tear its way out. "Emily, Emily, can you hear me?" Daniel's voice. Close, urgent. She turned her head slightly. The movement sent a sharp wave of pain through her skull. "Daniel? I'm here." He grabbed her hand immediately, gripping it tightly as if afraid she would disappear. "You fainted. You scared me." Her lips were dry. "What happened?" "You collapsed. I called an ambulance." Emily tried to sit up. A nurse stepped in quickly. "Ma'am, please don't move. The doctor will be here soon." Emily lay back down, her breathing uneven. Her vision flickered again. "Why does my head hurt so much?" she whispered. Daniel didn't answer right away. That silence lasted just a little too long. Then, "They found something," he said. Emily felt her heart skip. "What do you mean?" Before Daniel could respond, the door opened. A middle-aged doctor walked in, holding a tablet. His face carried that carefully controlled seriousness that doctors use when the truth is too heavy to drop all at once. "Ms. Carter," he said gently, "I'm Dr. Reynolds." Emily forced herself to focus. "Yes? We ran a CT scan after your collapse." He paused. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the hospital sheet. "And?" Dr. Reynolds inhaled slowly. "There appears to be a mass in your brain." The room went silent. Emily blinked. "A mass?" Daniel squeezed her hand harder. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice trembling just enough. Dr. Reynolds chose his words carefully. "It could be a tumor." Emily stared at him. No reaction at first. Then, "That's not possible." Her voice was flat, almost detached. "I was fine 2 weeks ago." "Some conditions develop silently," the doctor said. "Your symptoms, headaches, nausea, confusion, they align with what we're seeing." Emily shook her head slightly. No, this doesn't make sense." Daniel leaned closer, his voice soft, almost breaking. "Emily, listen to him." She turned to look at him. His eyes were wet. Or at least, they looked like they were. "We need to act fast." Dr. Reynolds continued. "The location of the mass suggests pressure on critical areas. If it's not treated immediately, it could lead to hemorrhage or permanent damage." "Permanent damage?" Emily whispered. "Yes. Or worse," Daniel added quietly. Emily closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt something she had never truly experienced before. Helplessness. "I need time to think," she said weakly. Dr. Reynolds shook his head. "I'm afraid we don't have much time." Ellipsis. 2 hours later, Emily was moved into a private room. Margaret arrived. She rushed in dramatically, her coat still damp from the rain, her voice already trembling. "Oh my God, Emily, my poor child." She grabbed Emily's hand, squeezing it tightly. Emily looked at her. For a second, she felt comfort. Familiarity. Family. "I'm okay," Emily whispered. "No, you're not," Margaret cried. They said you might." Her voice broke. Daniel stepped in, placing a hand on his mother's shoulder. "Mom, please." Margaret covered her mouth, sobbing. "I can't lose her, I can't." Emily watched them. Something inside her softened. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe everything she had suspected before was just stress. Just fear. They were here. They were crying. They were scared for her. This is what family looks like, she told herself. Right? Ellipsis. Late that night, the doctor returned. "We've reviewed your case," he said. "Surgery is necessary, as soon as possible." Emily swallowed. "How soon?" "Within 24 hours. Daniel leaned forward. "What's the cost?" The doctor hesitated. "Approximately $600,000 to $700,000. Depending on complications." The number landed like a hammer. The room went silent again. Emily's mind went blank for a second. Then slowly, the number connected. 700,000. The deposit. The money Harrison had trusted her with. Her chest tightened. She began. Daniel spoke before she could finish. "We'll pay it." Emily turned to him. "What?" Daniel looked at her, eyes filled with determination. "Money doesn't matter. You do." "That's not, Daniel, you don't understand. That money isn't ours. I don't care whose it is." His voice rose, then immediately softened again. "If you die, what does that money even mean?" Emily stared at him. Those words echoed in her head. "If you die, what does that money even mean?" Margaret stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Emily, listen to him. Nothing is more important than your life." Emily's thoughts spiraled. Harrison's warning came back to her. Do not tell anyone more than they need to know about that money. Large numbers make people reveal who they really are. She looked at Daniel. At Margaret. At the fear in their eyes. At the hands holding hers. They wouldn't. Would they? Her voice came out weak. That money, it's a deposit. If it's used wrong, I could lose everything. The company, my reputation, lawsuits? Daniel shook his head. You won't have a company if you're dead. Silence. Margaret leaned in, tears streaming down her face. I swear to you, she said, placing a hand over her chest. Every dollar will be used to save you. I will personally take care of everything. You just need to survive. Emily looked into her eyes. For a moment, they were full of tears. Full of desperation. Full of something that looked like love. Emily's resistance began to crumble. I don't, she whispered. Daniel took both her hands now. Trust me. That phrase. Simple. Dangerous. Have I ever let anything happen to you? He asked softly. Emily hesitated. Her mind flickered through memories. The rain. The umbrella. The soft voice. The late-night meals. The man who once said, I don't need your money. I just need you. Tears formed in her eyes. Okay. Her voice broke. Okay. Ellipsis. An hour later, the nurse brought her belongings. Emily reached for her wallet with trembling fingers. The black card. The one holding $700,000. For a second, her hand froze. Something deep inside her screamed. Stop. But Daniel was watching her. Margaret was watching her. Waiting. Emily forced herself to breathe. It's in here, she said quietly. Daniel gently helped her take it out. Margaret reached forward. I'll handle everything, she said. Emily placed the card into her mother-in-law's hand. Their fingers touched. And in that exact moment, Emily felt something strange. Margaret's grip tightened. Not with warmth. Not with reassurance. But with something else. Something colder. Margaret's tears stopped. Just for a second. Her expression changed. Subtly. Barely noticeable. But enough. Her eyes. There were no tears in them anymore. Only calculation. Only hunger. Emily blinked. Did I just imagine that? Margaret quickly pulled the card back, clutching it to her chest. I'll go take care of the payment now, she said, her voice suddenly steady. Too steady. Daniel kissed Emily's forehead. Rest. When you wake up, everything will be okay. Emily nodded weakly. But something inside her no longer felt okay. As Margaret walked out of the room, Emily turned her head slightly, watching her leave. The door closed. The room fell silent. Machines beeped steadily. Daniel sat beside her, holding her hand. Smiling softly. Too softly. Emily's eyes slowly closed. The sedatives began to pull her under. Her last thought before darkness swallowed her was not about the surgery. Not about death. But about the card. The card that now sat in Margaret's hand. And a single, quiet question. Why did her eyes look like that? Ellipsis. Hours later, deep in the hospital corridor. Margaret stood near the elevator. She looked down at the card. Her fingers tightened. Then, she slipped it into her purse. Turned around. And walked past the billing department. Without stopping. Without hesitation. Without even a glance. Because that card was never meant to pay for Emily's surgery. ICU corridor. Night. Darkness didn't come all at once. It came in waves. Heavy, slow, pulling Emily deeper each second, like something beneath the surface dragging her down. But she wasn't gone. Not completely. Somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, her mind clung to something, sound. Voices. Muffled at first. Distant. Then, clearer. She won't make it through surgery anyway. That voice. Daniel. Emily's heart skipped. If her body had been able to react, it would have jolted violently. But she couldn't move. Not her fingers. Not her lips. Not even her eyelids. Her body lay still on the hospital bed. Wires attached. Machines breathing life into her. But her mind. Wide awake. What about the money? Another voice whispered. Margaret. Close. Too close. Emily felt something cold spread through her chest. Daniel let out a quiet breath. I told you, it's already done. A pause. Then, Margaret's voice, lower this time. You withdrew everything? Every word landed like a blade. Yes, Daniel replied, all 700,000. Emily's mind screamed. No. No, that's not possible. That money was supposed to save her? Margaret let out a small, bitter laugh. The sound didn't belong to the woman who had cried at her bedside just hours ago. It was sharper. Colder. Don't be ridiculous, she continued. Look at her. Even if she survives, she'll be useless. Brain damage, maybe worse. What's the point of wasting money on someone like that? Emily felt something break inside her. Not her body. Something deeper. Something she had trusted. She's your wife, Margaret added, almost mockingly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched. Then, if she dies, it's better. The words were calm. Flat. Like he was stating a fact. Not talking about a human being. Not talking about the woman who had built his life from nothing. Not talking about her. Emily. I mean, Daniel continued, almost casually, what are we supposed to do if she lives? Take care of her forever? Pay for rehabilitation? Deal with lawsuits if that money goes missing? Margaret hummed in agreement. Exactly. Emily's breathing, monitored by machines, remained steady. But inside, her soul was collapsing. We already used the money for Lily's house, Daniel added. Emily's mind froze. Lily. House? Margaret's voice softened, but not with kindness. With that location in New Jersey, the value will double in a year. It's a smart investment. A much smarter one than saving a dying woman, Daniel said quietly. Silence again. Then Margaret sighed. Still, we need to be careful. If she somehow survives and asks questions. She won't, Daniel cut in. How can you be sure? Another pause. And then, I made sure of it. Emily felt a chill crawl through her veins. What does that mean? Margaret lowered her voice even further. The medication? Yes. Every nerve in Emily's body screamed. The dosage was enough, Daniel continued. Even if she survives the surgery, her brain won't be the same. Memory loss, confusion, maybe worse. Margaret let out a slow breath. Good. Good. That word echoed louder than anything else. Good. Emily's vision, though her eyes were closed, felt like it was cracking apart. Fragments of everything she believed in shattered in silence. The rain that night he waited for her. The umbrella. The soft voice. I don't need your money. I just need you. Lies. All of it. Carefully constructed. Patiently maintained. Until this moment. Margaret spoke again. And if she doesn't survive? Daniel didn't hesitate. Then everything is solved. Emily's heart stopped. For a fraction of a second. It felt like even the machines paused. And the company? Margaret asked. I'll handle it, Daniel said. As her husband, I'll have legal standing. We'll find a way. You've thought this through. I had time. Time. That word hit harder than anything else. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't desperation. This was planned. Every glass of milk. Every pill. Every, are you okay? Every, you just need to rest. Emily's mind replayed it all. The headaches. The dizziness. The nights she couldn't think clearly. The way Daniel always insisted on preparing her drinks. The unlabeled medication. The gentle smile. The careful concern. All of it. A slow poisoning. A quiet execution. Tears began to slide down from the corners of her closed eyes. She couldn't wipe them. Couldn't react. Couldn't scream. Her body was a prison. And inside that prison, she was being forced to listen to her own death sentence. I just hope she doesn't wake up during all this, Margaret muttered. She won't, Daniel replied. You're very confident. I know exactly what I gave her. Silence again. Then footsteps. Fading. The voices moved further away. Tomorrow morning. Sign the documents? Lily needs to finalize the property. The words blurred. Disappeared. But the damage was permanent. Ellipsis. Emily lay there. Alone. Trapped. Broken. Her mind replayed one sentence over and over again. If she dies, it's better. A tear rolled down her temple. Then another. Inside her, something shifted. At first, it was pain. Raw. Unbearable. The kind that crushes you completely. But slowly. Very slowly. That pain began to change. It hardened. Compressed. Like pressure building deep underground. I'm not afraid of dying. The thought formed, weak at first. Then stronger. I'm afraid of dying without knowing who killed me. Her breathing steadied. Not because she was calm. But because something else was taking over. Clarity. Cold. Precise. They think I'm already gone. They think I can't hear. They think I can't fight back. Another tear slid down. But this time, there was no helplessness in it. Only something darker. Something sharper. I trusted you. Her thoughts turned toward Daniel. Toward Margaret. I gave you everything. Her company. Her time. Her love. Her life. And you chose to kill me. Silence. Deep. Heavy. Then. A decision. Not loud. Not dramatic. But absolute. I will live. The words echoed inside her mind like a vow carved into stone. No matter what it takes. Her fingers twitched. Barely. So slight that no machine registered it. But it was there. A signal. A beginning. I will survive. Her breathing deepened, just a fraction. Even if I have to become someone else. The Emily Carter who believed in love. Who believed in family. Who believed in kindness above all else. She was already gone. What remained was something new. Something forged in betrayal. In pain. In truth. A hunter. Ellipsis. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Soft. Unnoticed. Inside the ICU, machines hummed quietly. Nurses moved through the corridors. Life went on. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. Because behind that closed door, on that silent hospital bed, a woman had just died. And in her place, something far more dangerous had been born. Ellipsis. And from that moment on, the thought echoed one last time as darkness finally claimed her. Emily Carter was gone. What remained was the one who would hunt them down. When Emily opened her eyes again, the world felt smaller. Not quieter. Not calmer. Just narrower. Like someone had taken her entire life and compressed it into a single fragile thread. A nurse noticed first. She's waking up. Footsteps rushed in. Voices followed. Emily, can you hear me? Daniel. Of course. He was right on time. Emily let her gaze drift slowly, unfocused, as if she were struggling to recognize where she was. Where am I? She whispered. Her voice came out weak, broken. Perfect. Daniel leaned in immediately, relief flooding his face. You're in the hospital. You had surgery. Emily blinked slowly. Surgery? She looked at him. Not with recognition, but with confusion. Who are you? The silence that followed was brief, but sharp. Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. It's me, Daniel, your husband. Emily frowned slightly, as if trying to remember. Then she shook her head. Just a little. I don't remember. Margaret stepped closer, her face pale. What do you mean you don't remember? Emily looked at her. The same blank confusion. I'm sorry, do I know you? Margaret froze. For a split second, her eyes flickered. Not sadness. Not fear. Something else. Calculation. Dr. Reynolds stepped in quickly. This is not uncommon, he said, given the nature of the surgery and the condition she was in. Temporary memory loss is possible. Daniel swallowed. How long will it last? It depends, the doctor replied. Hours, days, sometimes longer. Margaret exhaled slowly. Too slowly. As if adjusting to a new plan. Emily lowered her gaze, playing her part. Inside, her mind was razor sharp. Every word, every expression, every microsecond of silence. She recorded it all. So this is how they react. Not grief. Not panic. Relief. That confirmed everything. Ellipsis. Hours passed. Tests were run. Vitals checked. Emily answered questions carefully. Name? I don't know. Date of birth? I can't remember. Do you recognize him? She looked at Daniel. Long enough to make it believable. Then shook her head again. No. Daniel's eyes filled with something that looked like pain. But Emily saw through it now. Every gesture. Every tear. Every carefully timed breath. A performance. And she had learned from the best. Ellipsis. By the second day, the routine began. Daniel visited often. Margaret stayed longer. Watching. Waiting. Adjusting their strategy. Emily stayed quiet. Weak. Dependent. Exactly what they needed her to be. Exactly what she needed them to believe. But the real game started when Sarah walked in. Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Early 30s. Sharp eyes. Steady hands. And most importantly, someone Emily trusted. Emily, Sarah said gently, stepping closer. Emily looked at her, letting a flicker of something real slip through. Recognition. Just for a second. Then she blinked it away. I'm Dr. Mitchell, Sarah continued, playing along instantly. I'll be checking on you. Emily gave a small nod. Later that afternoon, when Daniel stepped out to take a call, Sarah returned. Alone. She closed the door quietly. Then leaned in. You heard them, didn't you? No hesitation. No confusion. Straight to the point. Emily didn't respond immediately. Her eyes stayed blank. But her fingers moved. Just slightly. Tapping once against the sheet. Sarah's gaze sharpened. Emily. Another tap. Slower this time. Yes. Sarah inhaled quietly. Okay, she whispered. Then don't say anything. Just listen. Emily's heart beat faster. Finally. Someone on her side. I suspected something was off. Sarah continued. Your symptoms didn't match a typical tumor progression. Emily's eyes flickered. I ran additional tests. Carefully, Sarah slipped a small folded paper into the blanket near Emily's hand. Don't react. Emily kept her breathing steady. Unchange. I'll come back later, Sarah said, stepping away. For now, keep acting. The door opened. Closed. Emily waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then slowly. Very slowly. Her fingers moved. She reached the paper. Unfolded it just enough to read. Her eyes scanned the words. Sedatives detected. Blood-thinning agents present. High risk of induced hemorrhage. Administered repeatedly over time. Emily's chest tightened. There it was. Proof. Not suspicion. Not fear. Truth. Cold. Clinical. Undeniable. Her lips twitched. Almost into a smile. So I wasn't wrong. For a brief moment. Her mind tried to fight back. What if this is a mistake? What if Sarah misunderstood? What if Daniel didn't know? What if Margaret was just? No. Her thoughts stopped. Cleanly. Decisively. She remembered the voices. The hallway. If she dies, it's better. The paper crinkled slightly in her grip. And then. Emily smiled. Not wide. Not visible. Just enough. A quiet, chilling acceptance. The game had begun. Ellipsis. But danger came faster than she expected. That night, sometime past midnight, Emily woke again. The room was dim. Only the soft glow of monitors illuminated the space. She heard footsteps. Light. Careful. A nurse entered. Not one she had seen before. Young. Expressionless. "Hey," the nurse said softly, "you're awake." Emily didn't respond. Stayed in character. Confused. Weak. The nurse approached. Holding a syringe. "Doctor ordered something to help you rest," she said. "You've been in pain." Emily's pulse spiked. Inside. But her face. Blank. The nurse reached for her arm. "Just a small dose," she added. "You'll feel better." Something was wrong. The way she avoided eye contact. The way her voice lacked warmth. The way her hand moved. Too fast. Emily tried to pull back. Just slightly. But her body was still too weak. The needle hovered inches from her skin. "This will help you sleep," the nurse whispered. "Forever." The word wasn't spoken. But Emily felt it. And then. "Stop." The voice cut through the air like a blade. The nurse froze. Sarah stood in the doorway. Eyes locked. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. The nurse hesitated. "Doctor's order." "Show me." Silence. The nurse's hand trembled. I don't have it on me." Sarah stepped closer. Took the syringe. Examined it. Her expression hardened instantly. "This isn't in her chart." The room went still. The nurse's face drained of color. I must have. Leave," Sarah said coldly. "Now." The nurse didn't argue. Didn't explain. She turned and walked out. Too quickly. The door shut. Sarah exhaled sharply. Then turned to Emily. "You're not safe here," she said. Emily's eyes met hers. For the first time. Fully. No confusion. No act. Just truth. "I know," Emily whispered. Her voice was still weak. But steady. Sarah nodded. "Then we move carefully. No sudden moves. No mistakes." Emily nodded slightly. Her mind already working. Already planning. "They tried to poison me. Then they tried to finish the job." Good. That made things simpler. No more doubt. No more hesitation. Only one direction forward. Ellipsis. The next morning, Daniel returned. Smiling. Concerned. Perfect as always. "How are you feeling today?" he asked gently. Emily looked at him. Blank. Fragile. I don't know." Daniel squeezed her hand. "It's okay, I'm here." Emily watched him. Studied him. Every detail. Every breath. Every lie. And then. She spoke softly. Do we have money for my treatment?" Daniel's expression flickered. Just for a second. Then he smiled again. "Don't worry about that, everything is handled." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Including the deposit?" Another flicker. Gone instantly. "Of course," he said. "Everything is under control." Emily nodded slowly. Lowered her gaze. Hiding the storm behind her eyes. Because she already knew. That money. Was gone. Every dollar. Not at the hospital. Not for her life. But somewhere else. Somewhere far from this room. And as that realization settled fully into her bones, Emily Carter smiled again. This time. Not with doubt. Not with pain. But with something far more dangerous. Because the pieces were all in place. The lies. The betrayal. The attempt on her life. And now. The missing $700,000. She closed her eyes slowly. Letting the silence wrap around her. Because the next move. Would not be theirs. It would be hers. And when she finally opened her eyes again. The woman they thought they had broken. Was already planning how to destroy them. The mansion was everything Lily had ever dreamed of. White marble floors. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows. A pool that reflected the California sunset like a painting no one could afford. And yet. It didn't belong to her. Not really. But that didn't matter. Not to Lily. She stood in front of the mirror. Adjusting her dress. Her lips curling into a satisfied smile. "Perfect," she whispered. From downstairs. Laughter echoed. A man's voice. Confident. Smooth. Dangerous. "Lily, your friends are here." "I'm coming," she called back, grabbing her phone and heading down. The party was already alive. Champagne glasses clinked. Music pulsed softly in the background. And at the center of it all, David. Tall, impeccably dressed, the kind of man people turn to look at without knowing why. He spotted her instantly. Smiled. Held out his hand. "There's my girl." Lily walked straight into his arms. "I told you not to start without me." "I would never," David said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're the reason any of this matters." Lily laughed softly. Around them, people whispered. "Is that him? The investor? I heard he owns 3 companies in Silicon Valley." "Yeah, and some real estate in Dubai too." Lily heard every word. And she loved it. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't the girl asking for help. She was the one people envied. Ellipsis. Across the country, in a quiet hospital room, Emily sat still. Listening. Watching. Planning. Sarah stood beside her, holding a tablet. "I got something," she said quietly. Emily didn't look up immediately. "Tell me." "Your sister-in-law," Sarah continued. "Lily, she's been spending heavily in Los Angeles." Emily's fingers tightened slightly. "Using the money?" "Yes." Sarah turned the screen toward her. "Photos. Receipts. Property records." Emily's eyes moved quickly. "The house. The purchase. The transfer of funds. All confirmed." "So it's real," Emily said. "Very," Sarah replied. Emily leaned back slightly. Silent. Then, "What about him?" Sarah didn't need clarification. She tapped the screen. A new file opened. "David Reynolds, that's the name he's using." "Using?" Sarah nodded. "Not his real identity." Emily's gaze sharpened. "Go on." "Multiple aliases," Sarah continued. "No stable employment records. No legitimate business registrations tied to his name." Emily's lips pressed together. "And?" Sarah hesitated. "Then. He's flagged in several investigations." "For what?" "Fraud, investment scams, identity manipulation." Emily let out a slow breath. "And debt?" Sarah nodded. "A lot of it." "How much?" "Estimated $15 million. Emily's eyes flickered. "Who does he owe?" Sarah looked at her. "You don't want to know." Emily held her gaze. "I do." A pause. Then. "Organized groups, not the kind that go through legal channels." Silence filled the room. Emily turned her gaze back to the screen. Photos of David. Smiling. Confident. Standing beside Lily. The irony was almost poetic. "They stole from me," Emily said slowly. "And now someone worse is stealing from them." Sarah crossed her arms. "What do you want to do?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Her mind moved fast. Connecting. Calculating. "This wasn't random," she said. "What do you mean?" "David didn't just find Lily by accident." Sarah frowned. "You think he targeted her?" Emily nodded slightly. "He saw the money, the house, the lifestyle, and he moved in. Like a predator," Sarah said quietly. Emily's expression didn't change. "No." She looked back at the screen. "Like a mirror." Ellipsis. 2 days later. Emily sat in silence as Daniel talked beside her. "And Lily's doing great," he said, scrolling through his phone. "You'd be happy for her." Emily tilted her head slightly. Confused. "Lily?" "My sister," Daniel reminded her gently. Emily nodded slowly. "Oh." Daniel smiled. "She met someone, a good guy, successful, takes care of her." Emily blinked. "Really?" "Yeah," he said, "he's impressive." Emily lowered her gaze, hiding the flicker in her eyes. "I'm glad," she whispered. Daniel squeezed her hand. "See, everything is working out." "Everything." Emily almost laughed. But she didn't. "Not yet." Ellipsis. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, Lily sat on the edge of the bed, staring at a document. Her fingers trembled slightly. "What is this?" she asked. David stood by the window, calm as ever. "Just paperwork." "For what?" "A loan." Lily looked up. "A loan?" "Relax," David said, walking over. "It's just a short-term thing. I need liquidity for an investment. High return." "How much?" $10 million. Lily's breath caught. "That's a lot." David smiled. "Not for us." "Us." That word always worked. "But why do you need me?" David sat beside her, took her hand. "Because I trust you." Lily hesitated. "Can't you use your own assets?" "I am," he said smoothly, "but it's faster this way. The house is already in your name." Lily looked at the paper again. Mortgage agreement. Her name. The house. Everything tied together. A small voice inside her whispered, "Something's wrong." But she pushed it down. Because the life she was living now. The parties. The attention. The luxury. It was everything she had ever wanted. And she wasn't going back. "I don't understand all this," she admitted. "You don't need to," David said softly. "That's why you have me." Lily looked at him. At his eyes. At the confidence he carried. "You won't leave, right?" she asked quietly. David smiled, leaning in just enough. "I'm not going anywhere." It was a lie. A perfect one. And deep down, Lily knew. She knew something didn't add up. She knew his stories change. She knew the numbers didn't always make sense. But she didn't care. "Even if you're lying," she whispered. David paused. "I don't care who you really are," she continued, "as long as you give me this life." Silence. David studied her for a moment. Then, he smiled again. And this time, it wasn't just charming. It was victorious. Ellipsis. Back in New Jersey, Emily sat by the window, watching the sky darken. Sarah stood behind her. "They're moving fast," she said. Emily nodded. "I know. We can stop this," Sarah added. "We have enough to intervene." Emily turned slightly. Her expression calm. Too calm. "No." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean no?" Emily looked out again. "They made their choice." "Emily." "They poisoned me," Emily said quietly. Sarah fell silent. "They stole everything from me," she continued. "They planned my death." Her voice didn't rise. Didn't break. It stayed steady. Cold. "And now." She paused. "They're walking into something worse." Sarah watched her carefully. "You're going to let it happen?" Emily didn't deny it. "I'm going to watch." Silence filled the room. Then, "Because this isn't just about revenge," Emily added. Sarah crossed her arms. "Then what is it?" Emily's reflection stared back at her from the glass. But it didn't look like the same woman anymore. "It's about truth." Her eyes darkened slightly. "They didn't just betray me." She exhaled slowly. "They destroyed themselves the moment they chose greed over everything else." Another pause. "And now, they need to see where that path leads." Sarah didn't argue. Because deep down, she understood. This wasn't cruelty. This was consequence. Ellipsis. Miles away. In a luxurious office. David signed a document. Stamped it. And smiled. "Almost done," he murmured. Behind him, a phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Unknown number. He ignored it. Didn't know that on the other end, someone was already watching him. Tracking him. Waiting. Ellipsis. Back in the hospital. Emily closed her eyes. Calm. Focused. Ready. Because the board was set. The players were in position. And for the first time, she wasn't the victim. She was the one controlling when the trap would close. And as the night deepened, Emily Carter made her decision. She would not stop them. She would not warn them. She would not interfere. She would let everything unfold. Exactly as it was meant to. Because sometimes, the most powerful move is doing nothing at all. California, Beverly Hills Mansion. The house was glowing. From the outside, it looked like something out of a dream, lights cascading across white stone walls. Music spilling into the night air. Luxury cars lining the driveway like trophies of success. Inside, champagne flowed like water. Laughter echoed through every corner. And at the center of it all, Lily stood, radiant. "This," she said, raising her glass, "is just the beginning." Applause erupted. Phones were raised. Videos were recorded. Live streams had already begun. Because this wasn't just a party. It was a statement. A declaration that Lily Brooks had finally arrived. Beside her, David smiled, one arm wrapped casually around her waist. "To new beginnings," he added smoothly. "To success," someone shouted. "To love," another voice chimed in. Glasses clinked. The music rose. And for a moment, everything looked perfect. Ellipsis. Across the room, Daniel adjusted his suit, glancing around with quiet satisfaction. "We did it," he muttered. Margaret stood beside him, her lips curved into a proud smile. "I told you," she whispered, "this was the right decision." Daniel nodded. "No one would ever guess." Margaret's eyes swept across the room. "They don't need to." Their gazes met briefly. A silent agreement. The past was gone. Emily was gone. And this was their future. Ellipsis. "Attention, everyone." David's voice cut through the music. The room quieted. He stepped forward, holding a remote in his hand. "I have something special to share tonight," he said, smiling. Lily leaned closer. "What is it?" she whispered. "A surprise," he replied. Guests turned toward the massive LED screen mounted on the wall. The lights dimmed. The screen flickered. And then, a video began to play. At first, it looked like a standard promotional clip. Luxury properties. Investment opportunities. David's voice narrating confidently. But then, the tone shifted. The footage changed. Clips of different identities. Different names. Different cities. Voices layered over each other. "You said you'd return the money? You promised?" He disappeared. Lily's smile faded. "What is this?" she whispered. David didn't answer. The video continued. Documents appeared. Bank transfers. Fake companies. Then, a recording. David's voice. Clear. Undeniable. "She's perfect," he said in the clip. "Naive. Desperate for status. The house is already in her name. Once the loan goes through, I'd disappear. Easy." Silence slammed into the room. Lily's breath stopped. "No," she whispered. The video didn't stop. More evidence. More voices. More victims. The illusion shattered in real time. Phones that were once recording for fun now streamed everything live. Comments flooded in. "What is happening? Is this real? He's a fraud. Oh my God, this is insane." Lily turned to David. Her voice trembling. "Tell me this isn't true." David finally looked at her. And for the first time, he didn't smile. He didn't pretend. He just exhaled slowly. "It's complicated." That was enough. Lily staggered back. No, you said." "I said what I needed to say," he replied calmly. Her world collapsed in a single sentence. Ellipsis. Before anyone could react further, the front doors burst open. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Heavy footsteps followed. Men walked in. Not guests. Not friends. Their presence alone shifted the air in the room. Cold. Threatening. Real. One of them stepped forward, his gaze locking onto David. "Found you." The room froze. David's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be here." The man smirked. "You owe us $15 million. We go where we want." Gasps spread through the crowd. Lily's knees nearly gave out. What is he talking about?" she stammered. David didn't answer. Because he didn't need to. The truth was already screaming around them. The man turned to Lily. "And you," he said, "you must be the lucky owner of this place." Lily shook her head frantically. I didn't know." "Doesn't matter," he cut in. "The debt doesn't disappear just because you're clueless." Margaret stepped forward suddenly. "This is a private event. You need to leave." The man glanced at her. Then laughed. "Private?" he repeated. "Not anymore." He pulled out a document. Waved it slightly. "Mortgage agreement. Signed. Collateral. This house." Lily's vision blurred. "No." Her voice cracked. "No, that's not possible." Daniel stepped in. "This has nothing to do with us." The man's gaze shifted to him. "Oh, it does." He flipped another page. "Because the money used to buy this house." He paused. "Wasn't yours to begin with." Silence. Heavy. Crushing. And then, a voice. Calm. Cold. Familiar. "No." Every head turned. At the top of the staircase, Emily stood. Alive. Still. Unshaken. Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel's face drained of color. Margaret's hands began to tremble. Lily stared, unable to breathe. "That money was mine." Emily descended slowly. Each step deliberate. Each movement controlled. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "You," Daniel whispered. Emily stopped in front of them. Her eyes met his. No warmth. No hesitation. "Did you miss me?" No one spoke. Because there was nothing left to say. Emily turned slightly, addressing the room. "This house," she said clearly, "was purchased using $700,000 that belonged to my company." Her gaze returned to Margaret. "To me." Margaret shook her head, backing away. "You're confused." "No," Emily cut in. "I was. Not anymore." She gestured lightly. The screen behind her changed again. Bank records. Withdrawal timestamps. Security footage. Margaret at the ATM. Daniel signing documents. Every move. Every lie. Exposed. Public. Irrefutable. Margaret collapsed into a chair. This isn't truth," Emily finished. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. "Then tell me," she continued, stepping closer, "which part isn't real?" Silence answered her. Daniel tried to speak. "Emily, listen." "No," she said quietly. "You had your chance." She turned toward the men who had entered earlier. "And now, so do you." The leader nodded slightly. Understanding. Then he looked back at Daniel and Margaret. "You heard her," he said. "Debt is debt." Margaret's voice broke. "We don't have that kind of money." Emily tilted her head slightly. "No?" She reached into her bag. Pulled out a document. "And yet, you were able to take mine." She placed it on the table. "A contract. Prepared. Precise." "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. Emily looked at him. "Your way out." Margaret leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "You signed this," Emily said calmly, "and you take full responsibility for the debt tied to this property." Daniel stared at her. "You're insane." Emily didn't react. "You wanted the house," she said. "You wanted the life. Now you take everything that comes with it." Margaret began to cry. "You can't do this." Emily's eyes hardened slightly. "I already did." The room fell silent again. Long. Heavy. Daniel looked around. At the guests. At the cameras. At the men waiting. At the undeniable truth closing in from every direction. Then, slowly, his shoulders dropped. He picked up the pen. Margaret sobbed. "No, don't." But it was too late. Because for the first time, there was no escape. No lie. No manipulation left to use. Just consequence. Daniel signed. Margaret followed. Their hands shaking. Their world collapsing. And Emily watched. Without smiling. Without satisfaction. Just watching. Because this wasn't victory. This was balance. Ellipsis. As the party dissolved into chaos. As guests whispered and fled. As live streams spread the story across the internet. Emily stood alone. Looking at them. The people she once called family. Now. Strangers. Broken. Ruined. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. Because everything that needed to be said had already been shown. Ellipsis. But as she turned to leave, a thought crossed her mind. Sharp. Unsettling. Something wasn't finished. Not yet. Because beneath all of this, the lies, the money, the betrayal, there was something darker. Something deeper. Something she hadn't fully uncovered. And as that realization settled in, Emily paused. Just for a moment. Because the truth was, this wasn't the end. Not even close. And as she walked out into the California night, one final thought echoed quietly in her mind. The real nightmare was only just beginning. The courtroom was colder than Emily expected. Not because of the air, but because of the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it judges. Rows of people sat motionless. Journalists, observers, strangers who had followed the story as it spread across the country. A scandal. A betrayal. A near-perfect crime that failed. And at the center of it all, Emily Carter. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, her face calm. If anyone looked closely, they might notice her fingers trembling slightly. But no one did. Because all eyes were on the man standing across from her. Daniel Brooks. He looked smaller. Not physically. But something about him had collapsed. The confidence. The charm. The carefully constructed mask. All gone. What remained was a man exposed. State your name for the record, the prosecutor said. Daniel swallowed. Daniel Brooks. His voice cracked. It was the first time Emily had heard fear in it. Real fear. Mr. Brooks, the prosecutor continued, you are being charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, financial fraud, and involvement in an illegal organ trafficking network. How do you plead? A pause. Long enough to stretch across the entire room. Then, not guilty. Murmurs spread. Emily didn't react. Not outwardly. But inside. She felt something shift. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just distance. Ellipsis. The trial lasted weeks. Evidence stacked one piece at a time. Carefully. Relentlessly. Sarah testified first. Her voice steady. Her words precise. The patient showed clear signs of prolonged exposure to sedatives and anticoagulants. She explained, this combination significantly increases the risk of internal bleeding, including cerebral hemorrhage. Could these substances have been administered accidentally? The defense asked. No, Sarah replied firmly. The pattern was consistent. Repeated doses. Controlled timing. Emily watched from her seat. Every word landed like confirmation. Not of what happened, but of what she already knew. Then came the recordings. The hallway. The voices. If she dies, it's better. Gasps filled the courtroom. Daniel's face turned pale. Margaret began to cry. But Emily didn't move. Because she had already cried. Already broken. Already rebuilt herself from those fragments. Now, there was nothing left to break. Ellipsis. Then came the deeper truth. The one even Emily hadn't fully understood. Until now. A federal agent took the stand. We uncovered communications linking the defendant to an illegal organ trafficking network operating across multiple states. The courtroom erupted. What? Someone whispered. That's insane. The judge slammed the gavel. Order. The agent continued. Mr. Brooks was in contact with individuals known to arrange medical transfers for high-paying clients. Patients with specific conditions were targeted. Emily's breath caught. Just for a second. Targeted. The word echoed in her mind. Is there evidence that Ms. Carter was one of these targets? The prosecutor asked. Yes, the agent said. Silence. Absolute. Crushing. Records indicate that her medical condition was manipulated to create eligibility for organ extraction under emergency circumstances. Emily's world didn't shatter. It didn't need to. Because something inside her had already prepared for this. Still, hearing it spoken aloud changed everything. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was something far darker. Far more calculated. Daniel hadn't just planned her death. He had planned to sell her body. Piece by piece. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Not to escape, but to hold herself together. Because if she let even one emotion slip, she might not stop. Ellipsis. When it was her turn to testify, the room felt heavier. Every step she took toward the stand echoed. Not loudly, but clearly. She sat, faced the court, and for the first time, spoke. I trusted him, she said. No drama. No raised voice. Just truth. I trusted them. She glanced briefly at Margaret. Then back forward. I gave them everything I had. A pause. Then. They gave me poison. Silence. No one moved. Because nothing else needed to be said. Ellipsis. The verdict came on a gray afternoon. Rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows. Almost like it had that night. Daniel Brooks, the judge began. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Gasps. Tears. Daniel's knees buckled slightly. But he didn't fall. He looked at Emily. Desperate. Broken. Emily. She didn't respond. Didn't even blink. Because whatever he was about to say didn't matter anymore. And Margaret Brooks, the judge continued, you are sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy and financial crimes. Margaret sobbed. Her voice cracked as she called out, Emily, please. But Emily remained still. Not out of cruelty. But because there was nothing left to give. Ellipsis. Lily never made it to court. By then, she was gone. Not physically, but mentally. Reports said she had been found wandering the streets of Los Angeles. Talking to herself. Repeating the same sentence over and over again. He said he loved me. Emily didn't go see her. Because some endings don't need witnesses. Ellipsis. Weeks later, life continued. As it always does. Relentless. Unforgiving. Emily stood in her apartment. Alone. The city stretched out before her. Alive. Unchanged. As if nothing had happened. She walked slowly into the kitchen. Opened the fridge. Took out a glass. And then, a carton of milk. Her hand paused. Just for a moment. The memories flooded back. The quiet nights. The gentle voice. Drink this. It'll help you sleep. Her fingers tightened around the glass. She poured the milk. Watched it settle. Still. White. Innocent. Just like before. Emily lifted it. Held it near her lips. And then. Stopped. Her hand trembled. Just slightly. Then. Without hesitation. She walked to the sink. And poured it all out. The milk swirled down the drain. Gone. Just like everything else. She placed the empty glass down. Stared at it. For a long time. Ellipsis. Later that evening. She sat by the window. A letter rested on the table beside her. Unopened. But she already knew who it was from. Daniel. She picked it up slowly. Turned it over. Her name written in his handwriting. Familiar. Too familiar. Her fingers traced the edge. Then. She opened it. The words were simple. Almost painfully so. I still love you. Emily stared at the sentence. Her expression didn't change. But her hand shook. Just slightly. Because love, even when it's fake, Leaves something behind. A mark. A scar. Something that doesn't disappear easily. She folded the letter. Placed it back on the table. Didn't tear it. Didn't burn it. Just left it there. Unanswered. Unresolved. Like everything else. Ellipsis. The night grew deeper. The city lights flickered. And Emily sat there. Quiet. Still. Alive. Not whole. Not healed. But alive. And sometimes. That was enough. Ellipsis. Voiceover. There are things in life that, once broken, will never be whole again. Trust. Love. Belief. But survival. A pause. Soft. Heavy. Survival is its own kind of victory. Ellipsis. Emily looked out at the city one last time. Her reflection faint in the glass. Not the same woman. Not the one who once believed in fairy tales. But not broken either. Something else. Something stronger. Because in the end, she didn't just get justice. She didn't just expose the truth. She didn't just survive. She chose to keep living. Even when it hurt. Even when it cost her everything. And that was the price of survival.